In a Portland suburban home, a 77-year-old grandmother was about to confront her daughter-in-law about protecting her grandson. What started as a simple attempt to say goodnight took a shocking turn when they came face to face with a manipulator's true nature. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical elderly woman. For 37 years, she had spent her life as a high school principal, known for her ability to see through deception and protect vulnerable students from predators. When she encountered Jessica Martinez-Chen blocking the stairway with calculated malice, she had no idea she was walking into a trap years in the making. Margaret's refusal to back down would lead to a fall that would expose a web of psychological abuse, medical manipulation, and financial exploitation. What began as a family dinner dispute would become a viral sensation that divided the nation. The Chen household would never be the same after an 8-year-old boy's testimony revealed the horrifying truth about the woman they trusted. The security. Cameras captured everything, but the real story was far more sinister than anyone imagined. When the footage went viral, Margaret found herself fighting not just for justice, but for her sanity, as her own family questioned whether she was the victim or the villain in a case that would redefine how America understands elder abuse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The dinner plates sat cold on the kitchen table, remnants of Jessica's famous lasagna congealing under the warm glow of the pendant lights. Margaret Chen watched her 8-year-old grandson Tommy push peas around his plate, his small shoulders hunched in a way that reminded her of David at that age, when he'd been trying to disappear from his father's critical gaze. "Tommy, finish your vegetables." Jessica's voice carried that particular edge Margaret had learned to recognize over the past 6 months of living in their Portland home. It wasn't the gentle firmness of a parent guiding a child. It was the sharp authority of someone who demanded immediate compliance. Tommy's fork paused mid-push. "But Mom, I said finish them." Jessica's tone dropped to something colder. "We don't waste food in this house." Margaret cleared her throat softly. "Actually, sweetheart, maybe he's just full. Growing boys sometimes." "Margaret." Jessica's smile never wavered, but her eyes flashed with something dangerous. "I appreciate your input, but David and I handle Tommy's discipline." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret had been a high school principal for 37 years. She knew the difference between a mother's firm guidance and something darker. She'd seen it in countless homes, countless families where control masqueraded as care. Tommy's eyes darted between the two women, sensing the undercurrent of tension that had become as much a part of family dinners as the perfectly set table and Jessica's practiced warmth. At 8, he couldn't name it, but he felt it. The air seemed to thicken whenever Grandma Margaret tried to advocate for him. "Of course," Margaret said carefully, her voice carrying decades of experience in diffusing volatile situations. "I just remember when David was Tommy's age, he had phases with certain foods." Jessica's laugh was musical, the kind that could charm strangers but chilled those who knew her well. "David turned out fine despite his mother's indulgences." The barb hit its mark. Margaret felt the familiar twist in her chest, the way Jessica could make her feel simultaneously intrusive and inadequate with a single, perfectly delivered comment. It was a skill honed over 3 years of marriage to David, 3 years of systematically isolating him from everyone who'd loved him before her. "Can I be excused?" Tommy's voice was small, uncertain. "After you finish your peas," Jessica replied. Without looking at him, her attention focused on Margaret with laser precision. Margaret watched Tommy's face crumble slightly. She saw the calculation in his expression, the weighing of immediate discomfort against Jessica's longer-term displeasure. No child should have to make that kind of tactical decision at the dinner table. "I'll help you with homework after dinner, sweetheart," Margaret offered, earning another sharp look from Jessica. "Tommy can manage his homework independently. We're working on building responsibility and self-reliance." The words were reasonable. Any casual observer would see a stepmother teaching valuable life skills. But Margaret heard the subtext, the systematic removal of support, the isolation disguised as independence training. She'd seen Jessica employ similar tactics with David, gradually convincing him that his mother's help was actually harmful interference. Tommy forced down the remaining peas with visible effort, his small face scrunched in distaste. "There. Can I go now?" "Brush your teeth, get into pajamas, and lights out by 8:30, Jessica commanded. "No stories tonight. You were late getting ready yesterday." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. Tommy was 8 years old. Stories weren't indulgence. They were connection, comfort, the building blocks of literacy and imagination. But she'd learned to pick her battles carefully in this house. Tommy stood slowly, his hopeful glance toward Margaret quickly suppressed when he caught Jessica watching. "Good night, Grandma." "Good night, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." As Tommy's footsteps disappeared up the stairs, the kitchen fell into the kind of silence that precedes storms. Margaret began clearing dishes, a habit from her own childhood where keeping busy meant avoiding confrontation. "You know," Jessica said conversationally, loading plates into the dishwasher with precise movements, "David mentioned you've been having some memory issues lately." Margaret's hands stilled on the water glass she'd been carrying. "I haven't had any memory issues. The other day you couldn't remember where you put your reading glasses, and last week you forgot you'd already taken your evening medication." Each example was technically true, but stripped of context. Margaret had searched for her glasses because Jessica had moved them while tidying up. The medication confusion had happened once, after Jessica had rearranged the bathroom cabinet without warning. "Minor things," Margaret replied evenly. "Normal for anyone my age." "Of course." Jessica's voice carried false sympathy. "It's just that David worries. We both do. Living here, you're under stress, adapting to a new environment. Maybe it would be better if you had professional supervision." The threat was delicately delivered, wrapped in concern. Margaret recognized it for what it was, the opening move in a longer game. Jessica was building a narrative, creating a foundation for some future action Margaret couldn't yet see. "I'm managing fine," Margaret said, her principal's voice emerging, despite her efforts to stay diplomatic. "Are you?" Jessica turned from the dishwasher, her expression shifting into something Margaret had never seen before. The careful mask of daughterly concern slipped, revealing something calculating and cold. "Because from where I stand, you're an elderly woman interfering with my family, undermining my parenting, and causing tension in my marriage." The transformation was startling. This was Jessica without her audience, without David to perform. 4. This was the woman Margaret had suspected existed but had never seen directly. "Tommy is my grandson," Margaret said quietly. "David is my son. This is my family too." "Your family." Jessica's laugh was sharp now, all music gone. "You're a guest here, Margaret, a guest who's overstayed her welcome." Margaret straightened, feeling her spine steel in the way it had when facing down angry parents or defiant teenagers. "I'm here because David asked me to be here." "David asked you because I convinced him it was the right thing to do." Jessica stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. Poor David, so guilty about his elderly mother living alone, so eager to be the good son. He never asked what I wanted. The admission hung between them like a weapon. Margaret realized she was seeing the real Jessica for perhaps the first time, not the loving wife and devoted stepmother, but the woman who saw people as obstacles to be moved or removed. "But don't worry," Jessica continued, her smile returning, but failing to reach her eyes. "I'm very good at getting what I want, and what I want is my family back, without interference." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. In 37 years of dealing with difficult personalities, she'd learned to trust her instincts about people. And every instinct was screaming that Jessica wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. "I think I'll go check on Tommy," Margaret said, moving toward the stairs. "No." Jessica's voice stopped her cold. "You won't." They stared at each other across the kitchen, two women who finally understood they were enemies. Margaret saw something flicker in Jessica's expression. A calculation, a decision being made. Tommy needs to learn that actions have consequences, that when you disrespect the rules, you lose privileges, including goodnight stories from grandmothers who don't know their place. Margaret felt anger flare in her chest, hot and righteous. This wasn't about Tommy's bedtime routine or household rules. This was about control, about Jessica's need to dominate every relationship in David's life. "You can't isolate that child from everyone who loves him," Margaret said, her voice carrying 3 decades of authority. "I won't let you." Jessica's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "You won't let me?" Margaret moved toward the stairs, intent on checking on Tommy despite Jessica's prohibition. She'd been walking on eggshells in this house for 6 months, biting her tongue, keeping the peace. But not tonight. Not when it came to Tommy's welfare. Jessica moved too, stepping into Margaret's path at the bottom of the staircase. "I said no. And I said I'm checking on my grandson." They stood facing each other, Margaret's foot on the first step, Jessica blocking her way. The younger woman's face had transformed completely now, all pretense of civility gone. "You're going to back away from those stairs," Jessica said quietly. "You're going to go to your room, and you're going to start looking into assisted living facilities because your time in this house is over." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. She was seeing Jessica's true face, and it was ugly, in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. "Move aside, Jessica. Make me." The words were said softly, almost playfully, but they carried a challenge that felt like violence. Margaret stepped up to the second stair, bringing her closer to Jessica's eye level. That's when Jessica's hands moved. Not a push, exactly. More like a sharp, calculated shove designed to look accidental. Margaret felt her balance shift, her aging body unable to compensate for the sudden momentum. The world tilted sideways as her feet slipped on the polished wood stairs. The fall seemed to last forever, and no time at all. Margaret's hip struck the edge of a step with a sickening crack that she felt more than heard. Pain exploded through her body as she tumbled, her head striking the newel post at the bottom with a dull thud that made her vision sparkle with stars. She lay crumpled at the base of the stairs, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her hip screaming with agony. Above her, Jessica's face appeared, already transformed back into its mask of concern. "Oh my God, Margaret! Are you okay? What happened?" Jessica's voice carried perfectly, loud enough to wake Tommy, to alert any neighbors who might be listening. The performance had begun before Margaret had even stopped falling. "I'm calling 911, Jessica announced, her phone already in her hand. "Yes. Hello? I need an ambulance. My mother-in-law has fallen down the stairs. She's elderly, takes medication for her heart condition. I think she might have been confused, maybe missed a step." Margaret tried to speak, to protest, but the pain in her hip was overwhelming. She could taste blood where she'd bitten her tongue during the fall. Above her, Jessica continued her Academy Award-worthy performance for the 911 operator. "No, I didn't see exactly what happened. I was in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner. I just heard this terrible crash. She's been having some memory issues lately, and her medications sometimes make her dizzy." Each lie was delivered with perfect concern. building a narrative that painted Margaret as a confused elderly woman whose own infirmity had caused her accident. Jessica was already rewriting history, and Margaret was powerless to stop her. When David's car pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later, he found his wife cradling his mother's head in her lap, tears streaming down her face as paramedics worked to stabilize Margaret for transport. "I'm so sorry," Jessica sobbed against David's chest as he wrapped his arms around her. "I should have been watching her more carefully. I know she's been unsteady lately." Margaret closed her eyes as they loaded her onto the stretcher, Jessica's hand squeezing hers with what anyone watching would interpret as loving support. But Margaret felt the pressure differently. Not comfort, but warning. The message was clear. This is what happens when you don't know your place. As the ambulance pulled away from the house, Margaret caught a glimpse of Tommy's face at his bedroom window, pale and frightened. She tried to lift her hand to wave, to reassure him, but the pain medication was already pulling her under. Her last coherent thought before unconsciousness claimed her was the devastating realization that Jessica had won the first battle in a war Margaret hadn't even known they were fighting. The first sensation was pain, a deep, grinding ache that seemed to emanate from her right hip and radiate through her entire body like electricity. Margaret's eyes fluttered open to find herself staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, its acoustic tiles dotted with tiny holes that swam in and out of focus. As her vision adjusted, hospital. The antiseptic smell confirmed what the pain had already told her. She was in a hospital bed, and something was very, very wrong. "Mom? Oh, thank God, you're awake." David's voice came from somewhere to her left, thick with relief and exhaustion. His hand found hers, warm and familiar, and Margaret felt a moment of comfort before the memories began filtering back through the haze of medication. The stairs, Jessica's hands, the fall. "What?" Margaret's voice came out as a croak, her throat dry as sandpaper. "What happened?" "You fell down the stairs, Mom. Do you remember? Jessica found you at the bottom. You've been unconscious. For almost 18 hours. 18 hours. Margaret blinked, trying to process the lost time. The last thing she remembered clearly was Jessica's face above her, already transformed into its mask of concern before the paramedics had even arrived. How was she feeling? The voice was Jessica's, but softer than usual, pitched to carry the perfect note of daughterly concern. Margaret turned her head slowly, wincing at the movement, to see Jessica approaching the bed with an enormous bouquet of white lilies. "I brought these from the gift shop," Jessica continued, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. "I know how much you love flowers, Margaret." Margaret stared at the lilies, their cloying fragrance already beginning to fill the small room. She'd always hated lilies, their association with funerals, their overwhelming scent. Jessica knew this. They'd discussed it just last month when Jessica had suggested lilies for the front garden, and Margaret had gently declined. But Jessica wasn't arranging the flowers for Margaret. She was arranging them for the audience, David, the nurses, anyone who might walk into this room and see the devoted daughter-in-law caring for her elderly mother-in-law. "Thank you," Margaret managed, the words feeling like sandpaper in her throat. "Oh, don't thank me. I just feel so terrible about what happened." Jessica's voice broke slightly, a masterful touch that drew David's immediate attention. "I keep thinking if I'd been watching more carefully, if I'd noticed you were having one of your dizzy spells." "Dizzy spells?" Margaret's voice sharpened, despite the medication clouding her thoughts. "I wasn't having the medication," Jessica continued smoothly, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. Dr. Morrison explained how blood pressure medication can cause dizziness in elderly patients, especially when combined with the heart medication you've been taking. Margaret tried to focus through the pharmaceutical fog in her brain. She'd been taking the same medications for 2 years without any issues, but Jessica was spinning a narrative, and David was nodding along, his face creased with worry and guilt. "I should have been more careful," David said, squeezing Margaret's hand. "I should have made sure you had a railing on those stairs, or—" "David, sweetheart, you can't blame yourself." Jessica's hand moved to his shoulder, a gesture of comfort that somehow looked more like possession. No one could have predicted this. Sometimes these things just happen with elderly people. Elderly people. Margaret felt the phrase like a slap. She was 67, not ancient. She'd been living independently until her minor heart episode. 6 months ago, the episode that had prompted David to invite her to stay with them temporarily while she recovered. "I need to speak with David," Margaret said, trying to inject authority into her voice despite the weakness she felt. "Alone." Jessica's smile never wavered, but Margaret caught the flash of something cold in her eyes. "Of course, I'll just go get some coffee and let you two catch up. The nurses said you might be disoriented for a while as the pain medication works through your system." Disoriented. Another perfectly placed word to undermine Margaret's credibility before she even spoke. Jessica kissed David's cheek with theatrical tenderness. "I'll be back in a few minutes, darling. Try not to tire her out too much." As Jessica left the room, Margaret gripped David's hand with whatever strength she could muster. "David, listen to me. What Jessica told you about my fall—" "Mom, please." David's voice carried that particular tone he'd used since childhood, when he wanted to avoid difficult conversations. "You need to rest. We can talk about all this later." "No, we need to talk about it now." Margaret struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the spike of pain in her hip. "Jessica pushed me, David. It wasn't an accident." The words hung in the air between them, like an accusation. David's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked dangerously like pity. "Mom, you hit your head pretty hard. The doctor said you might have some confusion about what happened." "I'm not confused." Margaret's voice grew stronger, fueled by frustration. "I remember everything. We were arguing about Tommy, about the way she treats him. She was blocking the stairs, and when I tried to go check on him, she pushed me." David pulled his hand away from hers, running it through his hair in a gesture she recognized from his childhood. Something he did when he was overwhelmed and looking for an escape route. "That doesn't sound like Jessica at all. She's been taking such good care of you, Mom. She's the one who suggested you come live with us when you had your heart episode." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Jessica had convinced David that the invitation had been her idea. In reality, Margaret remembered clearly that David had called her himself, worried about her living alone, insisting she stay with them until she was fully recovered. But somehow, in Jessica's retelling, she'd become the generous daughter-in-law opening her home to her husband's aging mother. The narrative was being rewritten, piece by piece, and David was accepting each revision without question. "David, please. Just think about what I'm saying. You know I'm not confused or disoriented. I was a high school principal for 37. Year to year, I know how to assess situations and people. I know, Mom, but—" "Knock, knock. Room for one more?" The voice was warm and professional, and Margaret turned to see a woman in her early 30s wearing scrubs and a friendly smile. She was petite, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm Dr. Sarah Patel, your physical therapist. I know it's a bit early for our first session, but I wanted to introduce myself and get a baseline assessment of your mobility." Dr. Patel's presence somehow changed the energy in the room. She moved with quiet confidence, checking Margaret's chart while simultaneously observing her patient with the kind of attention that suggested she saw more than just medical data. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Chen? Any nausea from the pain medication? Dizziness?" "Some cloudiness," Margaret admitted. "But my thinking is clear." Dr. Patel nodded, making a note. "That's normal. We'll start with some very gentle range of motion exercises once your hip stabilizes. The goal is to get you mobile as quickly as possible while ensuring proper healing. When will she be able to come home? David asked, and Margaret noticed how Dr. Patel's eyes shifted to him, assessing not just his words but his tone, his body language. That depends on several factors. Mrs. Chen's overall health is good, which works in her favor, but hip fractures in patients over 65 require careful management. We're looking at several weeks of rehabilitation, possibly more. Margaret felt a surge of panic. Several weeks in the hospital meant several weeks of being vulnerable, of being dependent on others for her most basic needs. It meant several weeks of Jessica controlling the narrative about her accident. Is there anything specific that might have contributed to the fall? Dr. Patel asked, her tone carefully neutral. Any balance issues, medication interactions, environmental factors? The doctor thinks it was probably a combination of her blood pressure medication and some disorientation, David said quickly. Jessica, my wife, she's been worried about Mom's stability lately. Dr. Patel's eyes flicked to Margaret, and for a moment their gazes held. Margaret saw something in the physical therapist's expression. Not skepticism exactly, but a kind of professional wariness that suggested she'd heard similar explanations before. Mrs. Chen, do you remember anything about the moments leading up to your fall? The question was addressed directly to Margaret, bypassing David entirely. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. The first time since she'd awakened that someone had asked for her version of events. I remember everything, Margaret said firmly. I was going upstairs to check on my grandson when… Mom, David interrupted gently. You might think you remember, but head injuries can affect memory formation. The doctor explained that to us. Dr. Patel's pen paused on her chart. Actually, Mr. Chen, memory of events immediately before a traumatic injury is often quite clear. It's retrograde amnesia, forgetting events from before the injury, that's more common, and that typically affects earlier memories, not the incident itself. Margaret felt a flash of gratitude toward this woman who was politely but firmly correcting David's assumption. Dr. Patel turned back to her patient. What do you remember about going upstairs? I wasn't going upstairs, Margaret clarified. I was at the bottom of the stairs, about to go up to check on Tommy, my grandson. And Jessica was… She paused, catching sight of David's face. He looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed, as if his mother's insistence on her version of events was somehow inappropriate. And Jessica was what? Dr. Patel prompted gently. Before Margaret could answer, Jessica herself appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of loving concern. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, Jessica said, handing 1 cup to David and smiling warmly at Dr. Patel. You must be from the physical therapy team. I'm… Jessica, Margaret's daughter-in-law. Dr. Patel accepted Jessica's handshake with professional courtesy. But Margaret noticed how the therapist's eyes remained alert, observant. I was just getting some background on Mrs. Chen's accident, Dr. Patel said. Oh, it was just terrible, Jessica said, her voice taking on that carefully modulated tone of distress. I was cleaning up in the kitchen when I heard this awful crash. Poor Margaret was lying at the bottom of the stairs, and I could tell right away that she was badly hurt. You didn't see the actual fall? Dr. Patel asked. No, unfortunately. I wish I had. Maybe I could have prevented it somehow. But Margaret had been having some balance issues lately, and I think her medications might have made her dizzy. Margaret watched Dr. Patel's face as Jessica spoke. The physical therapist's expression remained neutral, but Margaret caught something in her eyes, a sharpening of attention that suggested she was cataloging not just Jessica's words, but her demeanor. What kind of balance issues? Dr. Patel asked. Oh, nothing dramatic. Just little things. Steadying herself on furniture when she walked, that sort of thing. I mentioned it to David because I was concerned. Margaret felt her frustration building. Every word Jessica spoke was technically defensible. An elderly woman might naturally use furniture for support. Medications could cause dizziness. But, taken together, they painted a picture of someone whose accident was not just predictable, but inevitable. I haven't been having balance issues, Margaret said firmly. Jessica's smile remained constant, but her hand moved to David's arm in a gesture that looked supportive, but felt possessive. Oh, sweetheart, you might not have noticed. Sometimes, these things are gradual. I would have noticed if I were unsteady on my feet, Margaret insisted. I've been living independently for— Mom, please don't get upset, David interjected. The stress isn't good for your recovery. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. Every time she tried to assert her version of events, someone redirected the conversation back to her supposed frailty or confusion. It was gaslighting at its most sophisticated, not the brutal, denial of reality that left obvious scars, but the subtle erosion of credibility that made the victim doubt their own perceptions. Dr. Patel had been watching this exchange with the kind of quiet attention that made Margaret think she saw more. Then she was revealing. Mrs. Chen, the therapist said carefully, I'd like to schedule some time for us to talk privately about your physical therapy goals and timeline. Would tomorrow morning work for you? That would be perfect, Margaret said quickly, recognizing the offer for what it was, an opportunity to speak without Jessica's performance and David's protective interference. Wonderful. I'll be back around 10. Dr. Patel turned to David and Jessica with professional courtesy. In the meantime, try to keep visits relatively short. Rest is crucial for bone healing. As Dr. Patel gathered her materials, a young nurse appeared in the doorway, looking slightly flustered. Excuse me, Mrs. Chen? I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been some unusual activity regarding your case. What kind of activity? David asked. The nurse glanced around the room uncertainly. Well, it seems someone posted a video online, security footage of your mother's fall. It's been shared quite a lot on social media. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Security footage. She'd forgotten about David and Jessica's home. Security system. The cameras that David had installed after a series of break-ins in their neighborhood. Jessica's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Security footage? But that's private property. How could someone— We're not sure how it was obtained, the nurse said. But the hospital administration wanted to make you aware because some reporters have been calling, asking about Mrs. Chen's condition. Margaret's heart began to race, and she wasn't sure if it was from hope or terror. The footage would show what really happened. It would prove that Jessica had pushed her, that her accident was anything but it would also make their family's private tragedy into public entertainment. And Margaret had seen enough of Jessica's manipulative skills to know that she would find a way to control even this narrative. Jessica's hand tightened on David's arm. This is awful. Poor Margaret's privacy being violated like this. We should call our lawyer. Actually, the nurse said hesitantly, the video is getting a lot of attention online. People are calling it Justice for Margaret, trying to raise awareness about elder abuse. The words hung in the air like a revelation. Strangers on the internet had seen the footage and interpreted it as evidence of abuse. They were advocating for her, defending her, in a way that her own family had failed to do. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, not from pain this time, but from a complicated mixture of relief and humiliation. Relief that someone, somewhere, believed her story. Humiliation that her family's dysfunction was now entertainment for millions of strangers. We need to see this video, David said, pulling out his phone. David, no, Jessica said quickly. It will just upset you, and your mother needs rest, not more stress. But David was already searching, his face growing pale as he found the footage. Margaret watched his expression change as he saw what the security camera had captured: his wife blocking the stairs, the physical altercation, his mother's fall. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Jessica's voice filled the silence, already spinning, already controlling. "Oh my God, David. It looks so much worse than it was. The angle makes it seem like... But you know what really happened? I was trying to help her, trying to steady her. The camera doesn't show everything." Margaret watched her son's face, seeing the battle between what his eyes were telling him and what his wife was insisting he believe. And she realized that this was just the beginning, that the security footage wouldn't be the silver bullet she'd hoped for, but simply another battlefield in Jessica's war for control of the truth. The nurse cleared her throat uncomfortably. "I should mention, the video has been viewed over 2 million times in the past 6 hours. 2 million people had watched her fall down the stairs. 2 million strangers had seen her moment of vulnerability and helplessness." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. When she opened them again, Jessica was staring at her with an expression that chilled her to the bone. Not the mask of concern she wore for David and the medical staff, but something calculating and dangerous. The message in Jessica's eyes was clear. "You think this changes anything? You think strangers on the internet can protect you?" Margaret realized with growing dread that her fight for the truth was just beginning, and that Jessica had already won the first round by controlling the initial narrative. Now they were both prisoners of public opinion, but only one of them knew how to manipulate it. The war had gone viral, and Margaret wasn't sure she was equipped to fight it. Margaret stared at the ceiling tiles in her hospital room, counting the holes for the 100th time as the morphine drip made her thoughts swim like oil on water. 48 hours had passed since the nurse's revelation about the video, and the world outside her sterile sanctuary had exploded into chaos she couldn't have imagined. The first sign came with the flowers, not Jessica's theatrical lilies, but dozens of bouquets from strangers: sunflowers, roses, daisies, even a few potted plants with handwritten cards bearing messages like, "Stay strong, Margaret, and we believe you." The nurses had run out of space and started arranging them in the hallway. "Mrs. Chen?" A young nurse Margaret hadn't seen before peeked around the doorframe. "There's been another delivery. Gift baskets this time. Should I bring them in?" Margaret nodded weakly, still trying to process the surreal nature of her situation. She was a retired high school principal from Portland, Oregon. 3 days ago, the most attention she'd received from strangers was the occasional nod from fellow shoppers at the grocery store. Now, apparently, she was famous. David sat in the chair beside her bed, his laptop balanced on his knees, scrolling through social media with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. He'd barely spoken since yesterday's revelation, when the full scope of the viral phenomenon had become clear. 2.8 million views now, he said quietly, not looking up from the screen. The hashtag is trending nationally. Margaret closed her eyes. Justice for Margaret. She'd seen it on David's phone. Thousands of posts from people who'd watched 30 seconds of security footage and declared themselves experts on her family dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on her that strangers on the internet were more willing to believe she'd been pushed than her own son. "What are they saying?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. David's jaw tightened. "Most people think. They think Jessica pushed you on purpose. They're calling for her arrest, for an investigation. Some of the comments are pretty ugly." Margaret felt a complicated mixture of vindication and horror. She'd wanted someone to believe her, but not like this. Not as part of a mob mentality that reduced her family's trauma to entertainment content. "And what does Jessica say about all this?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's handling it better than I expected. She's agreed to do an interview this afternoon. Channel 8 News. She wants to set the record straight." Margaret's blood went cold. Jessica was going on television. The woman who could convince hospital staff that she was a devoted daughter-in-law, who could make David doubt his own mother's word, was about to perform for a television audience. "David, you can't let her do that." "I can't stop her, Mom. She has the right to defend herself against these accusations." "They're not accusations. They're the truth." David finally looked at her, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. Not disbelief exactly, but a kind of desperate hope that she was wrong. Because if she was right, it meant his entire marriage was built on lies. "The video is unclear," he said carefully. "It could be interpreted different ways." Margaret felt tears of frustration well up in her eyes. Even now, even with video evidence, David was looking for ways to give Jessica the benefit of the doubt. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Patel entered carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that was both professional and troubled. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen. How are you feeling today?" "Like my private life has become a circus," Margaret replied honestly. Dr. Patel glanced at David, then back at Margaret. "I've been following the media coverage of your case. It's quite unprecedented for a patient I'm treating." "Have you seen the video?" Margaret asked. "I have." Dr. Patel's response was careful, measured. "I'd like to discuss it with you. If you're comfortable, perhaps we could have some privacy for your physical therapy assessment." David looked up from his laptop. "I can stay." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Actually, Mr. Chen, it would be better if I could work with your mother one-on-one. Family members can sometimes inadvertently interfere with honest assessment." Margaret caught the subtle emphasis on honest and felt a surge of hope. Dr. Patel had seen something in that video, something that had raised professional concerns. After David left, promising to return with coffee, Dr. Patel closed the door and pulled her chair closer to Margaret's bed. "Mrs. Chen, in my professional opinion, what I saw in that video doesn't look like an accidental fall." The words hung in the air between them like a lifeline. Margaret felt tears spill over her cheeks, the first time anyone with medical authority had validated what she knew to be true. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me. I've seen enough elder abuse cases to recognize the patterns. What concerns me is how your family is responding to the evidence." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "David doesn't want to see it. Jessica, she's very good at making people believe what she wants them to believe. I noticed that during her visits, the performance aspect of her concern." Dr. Patel made a note on her tablet. "Tell me, have there been other incidents, other times when you felt unsafe or threatened?" Margaret thought about the months leading up to the fall, the subtle isolation, the way Jessica had gradually convinced David that his mother was becoming a burden, the systematic undermining of her credibility. "Nothing physical before this. But she's been working on David, making him think I'm more fragile than I am, more dependent, setting up a narrative." "For what purpose?" "I think she wants me out of their house, out of their lives. I'm an obstacle to her control over David." Dr. Patel nodded grimly. "Unfortunately, that fits a pattern I've seen before. What's unusual is how public this has become." As if summoned by their conversation, the television in Margaret's room flickered to life. David must have left the remote within reach, and the afternoon news was beginning. Our top story today: Portland grandmother Margaret Chen remains hospitalized after a fall downstairs that was captured on security video and has since gone viral. The footage has sparked a national conversation about elder abuse and family responsibility. This afternoon, Chen's daughter-in-law, Jessica Martinez-Chen, speaks exclusively with Channel 8 News to share her side of the story. Margaret's stomach dropped as Jessica's face filled the screen. She looked perfect, just the right amount. Of grief and exhaustion, her makeup expertly applied to suggest someone who'd been crying but was bravely holding herself together. Jessica, thank you for speaking with us during what must be an incredibly difficult time. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell the truth, Jessica replied, her voice carrying exactly the right tremor of emotion. It's been heartbreaking to watch this narrative develop online when the people commenting don't know our family or the full situation. Margaret gripped the bed rails as Jessica began her performance. Margaret is a wonderful woman, but she's been struggling lately. Her doctor can confirm that she's been having some balance issues, some confusion with her medications. As her caregiver, I've been trying to help her maintain her independence while keeping her safe. But viewers of the video say it appears you may have pushed Mrs. Chen down the stairs. Jessica's eyes filled with perfectly timed tears. I understand why people might see it that way from the camera angle, but what you can't see is that I was trying to steady her. Margaret seemed disoriented, and I was afraid she was going to fall. I reached out to help her, but she lost her balance anyway. Margaret watched in horrified fascination as Jessica reframed the entire incident. Every gesture, every inflection, was calculated to evoke sympathy while subtly reinforcing the narrative of Margaret as a confused elderly woman whose own infirmity had caused her accident. What would you say to people who believe this was intentional? I would say that they don't know how much I love Margaret, how hard this has been on our entire family. Jessica dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My husband David and I have been caring for her since her heart episode 6 months ago. We've watched her decline, tried to help her adapt to her limitations. This accident, it's exactly what we were trying to prevent. Dr. Patel made a sound of disgust. She's very good. She's a sociopath, Margaret said flatly. On the screen, Jessica was now discussing the online harassment she and David had been receiving, the death threats from strangers who'd judged her based on a few seconds of video. She spoke about the violation of privacy, the pain of having their family tragedy turned into entertainment. We just want people to pray for Margaret's recovery and respect our privacy during this difficult time. She's a proud woman, and I know she would be mortified to know that millions of people have watched her fall. The interview concluded with Jessica making a plea for donations to help with Margaret's medical expenses. A GoFundMe page had been set up to support the Chen family during this challenging time. Margaret stared at the screen in stunned silence. Jessica hadn't just defended herself, she'd turned herself into the victim. The grieving daughter-in-law trying to care for a declining elderly relative, now being attacked by online vigilantes who didn't understand the complexities of the situation. She's raising money off of this, Margaret said in disbelief. She's making money from pushing me down the stairs. Dr. Patel's expression was grim. Mrs. Chen, I think you need to consider that this isn't just about family dynamics anymore. This has become a public relations war, and your daughter-in-law appears to be winning. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her helplessness. She was trapped in a hospital bed, dependent on others for her most basic needs, while Jessica controlled the narrative from a position of apparent victimhood. What can I do? Who's going to believe me over her? She's young, articulate, and she's turning herself into a martyr. You need allies, Dr. Patel said quietly. People who can see through her performance and help you tell your side of the story. Like who? Like me, for starters. I'm documenting everything I observe about your family dynamics, your physical condition, your mental acuity. Medical professionals have credibility that can't be easily dismissed. Margaret felt a flicker of hope. You'd do that? Mrs. Chen, in my professional opinion, you've been the victim of domestic violence. I have an ethical obligation to document that and help you seek protection. Outside Margaret's room, the chaos continued to build. More flowers arrived, more reporters called, more strangers on the internet declared their allegiance to one side or the other, based on fragments of information and personal bias. But inside the room, Margaret felt something shift. For the first time since her fall, she wasn't alone in her fight for the truth. Dr. Patel had seen through Jessica's performance and was willing to risk professional involvement to help her. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And as Margaret watched Jessica's interview loop on the news cycle, she realized that her daughter-in-law had made a critical error. By going public, by making herself the face of this story, Jessica had opened herself up to scrutiny from people who didn't love her, didn't need her, and couldn't be manipulated by her charm. Somewhere out there was a journalist looking for the real story, someone who would dig deeper than the surface narrative Jessica was selling. Margaret had to believe that, had to hope that the truth would eventually surface from beneath the carefully constructed lies. The war had indeed gone viral, but Margaret was no longer fighting it alone. The physical therapy rooms smelled like disinfectant and hope, an odd combination that Margaret had come to associate with Dr. Sarah Patel's twice-daily visits. 5 days into her hospital stay, Margaret's world had shrunk to the rhythm of these sessions. The careful stretching, the measured movement, the quiet conversations that had become lifelines to sanity in an increasingly surreal situation. "Breathe through it," Dr. Patel coached as Margaret struggled to lift her right leg against the resistance band. The pain shot from her healing hip down to her toes, but Margaret gritted her teeth and pushed through it. Pain she could handle. It was the helplessness that was killing her. "Good. That's real progress." Dr. Patel made a note on her tablet. "Your muscle response is excellent for someone your age. No signs of the weakness or instability that would suggest chronic balance issues." The words carried weight beyond their medical meaning. Dr. Patel wasn't just commenting on Margaret's physical condition. She was building a case, documenting evidence that contradicted Jessica's carefully constructed narrative of an elderly woman whose own frailty had caused her accident. "You're gathering evidence," Margaret said, lowering her leg with relief. "I'm doing my job," Dr. Patel replied, but her slight smile suggested she understood exactly what Margaret meant. "Speaking of which, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about the timeline of events leading up to your fall." Margaret glanced toward the door, confirming it was closed. David's visits had become shorter and more strained since Jessica's television interview. He seemed caught between loyalty to his mother and fear of confronting what the evidence was telling him about his wife. "I've been thinking about it too," Margaret said. "Jessica's been setting this up for months, hasn't she? Making me look incompetent." Dr. Patel pulled out a small notebook, not her official medical tablet, but something personal. "Walk me through it." "When did you first notice the pattern?" Margaret closed her eyes, thinking back to the early days of living with David and Jessica. "It started small. She'd move my things around the house, then act concerned when I couldn't find them. She'd mentioned to David that I seemed confused about where I'd put my reading glasses or my medication. Classic gaslighting technique. Make the victim doubt their own perceptions while building credibility with third parties. Then there were the doctor visits. She insisted on coming with me, said she wanted to help, but she'd tell the doctors about symptoms I wasn't having, side effects I wasn't experiencing." Dr. Patel frowned, making notes. "What kind of symptoms?" "Dizziness, memory problems, difficulty sleeping. All things that could be attributed to my medications or my age. The doctors would adjust my prescriptions based on what Jessica told them, not on what I was actually experiencing." "Did you try to correct these reports?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Of course, but Jessica would look so concerned, so apologetic. She'd say something like, 'Oh, Margaret, you always downplay your symptoms. Remember when you told Dr. Morrison you were feeling fine, and then you had that dizzy spell in his parking lot?' But you didn't have a dizzy spell." "No, I stumbled slightly on an uneven curb." Jessica turned it into evidence of a balance disorder. Dr. Patel's pen moved rapidly across the page. This is important, Mrs. Chen. This establishes a pattern of manipulation that goes well beyond the incident on the stairs. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Margaret tensed, expecting to see Jessica's perfectly composed face. But instead, a young man in his 20s appeared, wearing jeans and a rumpled button-down shirt that suggested he'd been working long hours. "Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm Marcus Rivera from Pacific Northwest Today. I was hoping I could speak with Mrs. Chen about—" "No journalists," Dr. Patel said firmly, moving protectively closer to Margaret's wheelchair. "Mrs. Chen is not giving interviews. Please, just 5 minutes. I've been following the story, and I think there are some inconsistencies in the narrative that need to be explored." Margaret studied the young man's face. He had the eager intensity of someone who smelled a real story beneath the surface drama. Unlike the television reporters who'd been calling the hospital, this one didn't look like he was hunting for sound bites. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Margaret asked, ignoring Dr. Patel's warning look. Marcus glanced at Dr. Patel, then back at Margaret. "Your daughter-in-law has given several interviews in the past week. The details of her story keep changing, in small ways. The timing of events, her location in the house when you fell, even her description of your supposed medical issues. You noticed that?" Margaret felt a surge of hope. "I'm trained to notice discrepancies. And frankly, something about her. Interviews bothers me. The performance aspect of her grief." Dr. Patel relaxed slightly. "You think she's lying? I think she's very carefully managing her public image, which makes me wonder what she's trying to hide." Margaret made a decision. That surprised even herself. "Show me what you found." Marcus pulled out his phone and opened a video file. "This is from her interview yesterday on Good Morning Portland. Watch how she describes the moments before your fall." On the small screen, Jessica's face appeared, perfectly lit and made up for television. Margaret had been acting strange all evening. She seemed disoriented during dinner, confused about simple things. I was concerned about her, which is why I was staying close when she decided to go upstairs. "Now watch this," Marcus said, swiping to another video. "This is from her Channel 8 interview 3 days ago. The same face, the same expression of concern, but different words. I was in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner when I heard the crash. Margaret had seemed fine all evening. We'd had a lovely family dinner together." Margaret felt her heart racing. "In the first interview, she says she was staying close to me because I seemed disoriented. In the second, she says she was in the kitchen and I seemed fine." "Exactly. And there are other inconsistencies. In one interview, she mentions that you'd been having balance problems for weeks. In another, she says the fall came as a complete shock because you'd been managing so well." Dr. Patel leaned forward, studying the phone screen. "Someone who's telling the truth doesn't need to keep adjusting their story." Marcus nodded. "That's what got my attention. But it's more than just the inconsistencies. I've been researching your daughter-in-law's background, and there are some interesting gaps in her history." "What kind of gaps?" Margaret asked. "Employment records that don't quite line up, references who seem to have disappeared, previous relationships that ended under mysterious circumstances. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to make me want to dig deeper." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Jessica's careful control of information, her ability to reinvent herself when necessary, it all fit with what Margaret had observed during her months in the house. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "The GoFundMe page she set up for your medical expenses, it's raised over $50,000 in 4 days. But when I checked the payment structure, the money goes directly to an account controlled exclusively by Jessica." "She's profiting from this," Dr. Patel said in disgust. "She's profiting from pushing me down the stairs," Margaret corrected, "and using people's sympathy to do it." Marcus put his phone away and pulled out a business card. "Mrs. Chen, I think your story is more complicated than what's being reported. If you're willing to talk to me, really talk, about your experiences with Jessica, I'd like to help you tell your side. Margaret took the card, feeling its weight like a small anchor in the storm of media manipulation surrounding her case. Why? Why do you care about one old woman's family problems? Marcus's expression grew serious. Because I think you're telling the truth, and I think she's dangerous. Not just to you, but potentially to other people. Sociopaths don't stop with one victim. Dr. Patel glanced at her watch. I need to get Mrs. Chen back to her room for her medication, but Mr. Rivera, would you be interested in some background information about elder abuse patterns? From a medical perspective? Absolutely. As Dr. Patel wheeled Margaret back toward her room, they passed the television lounge where several patients and visitors were gathered around a large screen. Margaret caught a glimpse of a familiar face and asked Dr. Patel to stop. Jessica was on Good Morning America, looking radiant despite her supposed grief. She sat across from the host with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, every inch the devoted daughter-in-law overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. The online harassment has been devastating for our family, Jessica was saying. David, my husband, he's been getting death threats at work. People have been calling our house at all hours, screaming accusations. It's turned our tragedy into a nightmare. The host nodded sympathetically. How is Margaret doing? Have you been able to visit her? Every day. She's making good progress physically, but emotionally. Jessica paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She's been so confused about what happened. The trauma of the fall, combined with her medications, has left her with some very distorted memories of that night. Margaret gripped the arms of her wheelchair. She's telling them I'm delusional. On screen, Jessica continued her performance. The doctors have explained that head injuries can cause false memories, especially in elderly patients. Margaret is convinced that I somehow caused her fall. It breaks my heart that she believes that. Have the police investigated the incident? There's nothing to investigate. The medical team confirmed that Margaret's injuries are consistent with an accidental fall. The video that went viral shows exactly what happened. An elderly woman with balance issues who lost her footing on the stairs. The host leaned forward with practiced concern. What would you say to viewers who believe the video shows something more sinister? Jessica's expression grew pained but resolute. I would ask them to remember that we're talking about a real family, real people who are hurting. Margaret raised my husband to be a wonderful man. She's been like a mother to me. The idea that I would ever hurt her it's unthinkable. Margaret felt sick watching the performance. Jessica was positioning herself as the true victim, the loving daughter-in-law being falsely accused by a confused elderly woman and attacked by an online mob that didn't understand the situation. She's winning, Margaret said quietly. Doctor. Patel squeezed her shoulder. Not yet. Marcus Rivera saw through her performance, and so will others. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when someone is working that hard to bury it. As they approached Margaret's room, David was emerging, his face grim. He'd been visiting less frequently since the media attention intensified, and when he did come, their conversations were stilted and brief. David! Margaret called out. How are you holding up? He looked older than his 32 years, worn down by the impossible position he'd been placed in. I'm managing, Mom. Jessica sends her love. She wanted to visit today, but the reporters outside have been aggressive. Margaret noticed how he avoided eye contact, focusing on some point just over her shoulder. David, we need to talk about what's really happening here. Mom, please, not now. When then? When Jessica's finished rewriting history? When you've convinced yourself that your own mother is delusional? David's jaw tightened. I've never said you were delusional. But you haven't said I'm telling the truth either. Dr. Patel cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps I should give you some privacy. No, David said quickly. I was just leaving anyway. I have to get back. To work? As he started to walk away, a small voice called out from behind him. Daddy! Tommy came running down the hallway, his backpack bouncing with each step. He launched himself into David's arms with the uncomplicated joy of an 8-year-old who'd found his father in an unexpected place. What are you doing here, buddy? David asked, kneeling to Tommy's level. Mom had to sign some papers, so she brought me. She said we could visit Grandma Margaret for just a minute. Margaret's heart clenched at the sight of her grandson. He looked tired, thinner than when she'd last seen him, with dark circles under. His eyes that suggested the stress of the situation was affecting him more than the adults realized. Hello, sweetheart, Margaret said gently. How are you doing? Tommy looked around uncertainly, then stepped closer to her wheelchair. I miss you, Grandma. When are you coming home? The question hung in the air like an accusation. David shifted uncomfortably, and Margaret realized that no one had explained to Tommy that she wouldn't be coming back to their house. I'm not sure, sweetheart. I'm getting better. But it might be a while. Tommy nodded solemnly, then leaned closer and lowered his voice to a whisper. Grandma, I saw what happened on the stairs. Margaret's breath caught. What did you see? Tommy? I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard you and Mom arguing. I looked out my door and I saw... He glanced nervously at his father, then back at Margaret. I saw Mom push you. The words fell into the hallway like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to spread outward from where they stood. David went pale, his hands still resting on Tommy's shoulders. Tommy, David said carefully, are you sure about what you saw? Yes, Daddy. Mom was mad because Grandma wanted to come upstairs to say goodnight to me. Mom said no, and when Grandma tried to go up anyway, Mom pushed her down. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. An 8-year-old child had just confirmed what she'd been trying to tell everyone for a week. Tommy had seen the truth, untainted by adult complications or loyalty conflicts. David stared at his son with an expression of growing horror. For the first time since Margaret's fall, he was hearing testimony that couldn't be dismissed as confusion or false memory. Tommy was too young to fabricate such a detailed lie, too innocent to understand the implications of what he was saying. Tommy, David said quietly, why didn't you tell me this before? Mom said I had a bad dream. She said sometimes when people are scared, they think they see things that didn't really happen. She said if I kept talking about it, you might think I was lying. The final piece of Jessica's manipulation revealed itself. She'd silenced the only witness by convincing him that his own perceptions were unreliable, that speaking the truth would get him in trouble with his father. Margaret reached out and took Tommy's small hand in hers. You're very brave for telling us, sweetheart, and you're not lying. You saw exactly what happened. David looked stricken, the careful neutrality he'd maintained for a week finally cracking under the weight of his son's testimony. I need to think about this. Daddy? Tommy looked up at his father with confusion. Are you mad at me? Nobody. I'm not mad at you. I'm proud of you for telling the truth. As David led Tommy away, promising to return later to talk more, Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. The truth was finally emerging, but at the cost of David's faith in his marriage and Tommy's sense of security in his own home. Dr. Patel wheeled Margaret into her room and closed the door behind them. That changes everything, she said quietly. Margaret nodded, still processing the implications of Tommy's revelation. She tried to silence him, an 8-year-old child. And she almost succeeded, if we hadn't been there to hear his testimony. Margaret thought about Marcus Rivera's business card in her pocket, about his promise to help her tell her story. With Tommy's testimony and Dr. Patel's medical observations, they might finally have enough evidence to challenge Jessica's carefully constructed narrative. But she also thought about the look on David's face as he processed his son's words. The dawning realization that his wife was not who he thought she was, that his mother had been telling the truth all along. Jessica had won the first battles of this war, but Margaret was beginning to think the tide might be turning. The truth was a powerful weapon, even against someone as manipulative as Jessica Martinez-Chen. The question now was whether it would be powerful enough to overcome the head start Jessica had gained, or whether she would find a way to discredit even Tommy's innocent testimony. Margaret settled back into her hospital bed, Marcus Rivera's card clutched in her hand, and prepared for the next phase of her fight for justice. She was no longer alone, no longer dismissed as a confused elderly woman. She had allies now, and, more importantly, she had the truth. Jessica's carefully constructed house of lies was beginning to show cracks, and Margaret intended to bring the whole structure down. Marcus Rivera sat in his cluttered apartment at 2 a.m, surrounded by printouts, sticky notes, and empty coffee cups. His laptop screen cast a blue glow across a timeline he'd been constructing for the past 3 days. A detailed map of Jessica Martinez-Chen's life that revealed patterns more disturbing than he'd initially imagined. The first red flag had been the employment gaps. Jessica claimed to have worked as a marketing coordinator for a Portland nonprofit between 2019 and 2021. But when Marcus called the organization, they had no record of her employment. The reference she'd listed, a supervisor named Margaret Chen, no relation to David, seemed to have vanished entirely. No social media presence, no current phone number, no trace in any database Marcus could access. The second relationship had been easier to track. Robert Henley, a divorced accountant Jessica had dated for 8 months before meeting David. Marcus had found Robert through mutual friends on Facebook and convinced him to meet for coffee. She was amazing at first, Robert had told him, stirring sugar into his latte with nervous energy. Attentive, supportive, everything I thought I wanted after my divorce. But then things started getting weird. Weird how? She'd isolate me from my friends, always had some reason why I shouldn't hang out with them. She convinced me my ex-wife was trying to manipulate me through our kids, that I needed to distance myself from that toxic situation. Before I knew it, I was seeing my own children every other weekend instead of the shared custody we'd arranged. Marcus had made careful notes, recognizing the pattern from Margaret's description of Jessica's behavior with David. What made you finally end? Robert's face had darkened. I found out she'd been going through my phone, my emails, even my financial records. When I confronted her about it, she turned it around on me, said I was being paranoid, that my accusations showed I wasn't ready for a committed relationship. She made me feel like I was the problem. How did the relationship end? Badly. She tried to make things difficult with my ex-wife, told her some lies about my mental state, my fitness as a father. It took months to repair that damage. And the strangest thing was, after we broke up, she seemed to just disappear, moved out of her apartment, changed her phone number, like she'd never existed. Marcus had left that meeting with a chill of recognition. Jessica's pattern was becoming clear. She attached herself to vulnerable men, isolated them from their support systems, then disappeared when they became too difficult to control, or when something better came along. David had been the something better: stable income, no ex-wife complications, and a mother whose modest savings and eventual inheritance would provide additional security. Now, as Marcus stared at his timeline, he was trying to track down Elena Vasquez, the one person who might have witnessed Jessica's behavior before she'd learned to hide it so well. Elena's social media presence was sparse but telling. She'd been Jessica's roommate and apparent best friend until early 2022, shortly after Jessica had married David. Then, abruptly, all photos of the two women together disappeared from Elena's accounts. No birthday wishes, no tagged locations, no trace of what had clearly been a close friendship. Marcus had found Elena's current address through property records, a small apartment in southeast Portland, about 20 minutes from David and Jessica's house. He'd driven by twice, trying to work up the courage to knock on her door. Something about Elena's sudden disappearance from Jessica's life suggested their friendship had ended badly, possibly dangerously. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patel. "Can you meet tomorrow morning? New developments." Marcus glanced at the clock. In 5 hours, he needed to be at the hospital to interview Margaret about Jessica's manipulation tactics. Dr. Patel had been documenting everything: Margaret's physical progress, which contradicted Jessica's claims about balance issues, and the psychological patterns that suggested systematic gaslighting. But first, he needed to talk to Elena Vasquez. Elena sat at her kitchen table, laptop open to the same news article she'd been reading for the past hour. Jessica's face smiled back at her from the screen. That perfectly composed expression Elena remembered from their years of friendship, back when she'd thought. Jessica's confidence was inspiring rather than terrifying. The article was Marcus Rivera's latest piece for Pacific Northwest Today. Margaret Chen case, questions multiply as story changes. It was the first media coverage that didn't present Jessica as a martyred caregiver, and Elena could practically feel Jessica's rage radiating through the screen. Elena's phone had been buzzing with unknown numbers for 3 days. She'd stopped answering, terrified that one of them might be Jessica. They hadn't spoken in over 2 years, not since Elena had tried to warn David about what kind of woman he was marrying. That conversation had ended their friendship permanently and taught Elena exactly how dangerous Jessica could be when someone threatened her carefully constructed reality. She'd been Jessica's maid of honor, had helped plan the wedding, had genuinely believed that David was going to be good for her friend. Jessica had seemed more stable than Elena had ever seen her, less desperate, more grounded. It wasn't until after the wedding that Elena began to see the familiar patterns emerging. The isolation had started slowly. Jessica would make plans with Elena, then cancel at the last minute because David needed her for something. She'd suggest they meet for coffee, then spend the entire time checking her phone and talking about David's work, David's needs, David's mother's interfering presence in their lives. When Elena had finally worked up the courage to suggest that Jessica seemed to be losing herself in her marriage, Jessica's reaction had been swift and brutal. "You're jealous," Jessica had said, her voice taking on that cold tone Elena remembered from their college years. "You can't stand that I'm happy, that someone actually wants to take care of me." "That's not what this is about, Jess. I'm worried about you. You used to be so independent." "Independent? Is that what you call it when I was working 3 jobs just to pay rent on our shitty apartment? When I was dating losers who treated me like garbage? David loves me. He wants to protect me, provide for me. I'm sorry that threatens you." The conversation had escalated from there, with Jessica accusing Elena of trying to sabotage her marriage, of being bitter about her own single status, of never really being a supportive friend. By the end of it, Elena had been questioning her own motives, wondering if Jessica was right about her jealousy. It wasn't until weeks later, when Elena tried to call and found that Jessica had blocked her number, that she realized how completely she'd been manipulated. Jessica had turned Elena's genuine concern into an attack on her marriage, then used Elena's defensive responses as evidence of bad faith. The friend Elena had known for 5 years had vanished, replaced by someone who could rewrite history and manipulate emotions with surgical precision. Now, watching Jessica's performance on national television, Elena recognized every technique. The way Jessica positioned herself as the victim while subtly undermining Margaret's credibility. The careful selection of details that painted a picture without explicitly lying. The emotional manipulation that made questioning her story seem cruel and heartless. Elena knew she should contact that journalist, Marcus Rivera. She had information that could help Margaret Chen, stories that could expose Jessica's pattern of behavior. But she also remembered what had happened to Robert Henley when he'd tried to stand up to Jessica, how she'd nearly destroyed his relationship with his children. Elena didn't have children, but she had a job she loved, a new relationship that was slowly healing her trust issues, a life she'd carefully rebuilt after extricating herself from Jessica's orbit. Was she willing to risk all of that to help a woman she'd never met? Her laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender's name made her blood run cold. J. Martinez-Chen mail, com. The subject line read, "Thinking of you." Elena's hand trembled as she clicked on the message. "Hi, Elena. I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I've been thinking about our friendship lately, especially with everything that's been happening with David's mother. I hope you're doing well. I saw on LinkedIn that you got promoted at your firm. Congratulations. I'd love to catch up sometime if you're interested. It would be nice to reconnect. Love, Jessica." The message was perfectly innocent on the surface, but Elena could read the subtext like a neon sign. Jessica knew Elena was watching the news coverage. She knew Elena had information that could damage her carefully constructed narrative. This wasn't a friendly overture, it was a warning. The mention of Elena's job was particularly chilling. Jessica was letting her know that she'd been keeping tabs, that she knew where Elena worked, what her life looked like now. The implicit threat was clear. Don't interfere, or everything you've built since our friendship ended could disappear. Elena closed the laptop and walked to her window, looking out at the Portland skyline. Somewhere out there, Margaret Chen was lying in a hospital bed, probably feeling as alone and helpless as Elena had felt when Jessica had turned their entire friendship into a weapon against her. The difference was that Margaret was 77 years old, recovering from a broken hip, dependent on others for her most basic needs. Elena was 31, healthy, financially stable, and she still felt terrified at the thought of challenging Jessica's version of reality. But Margaret deserved the truth. And more importantly, David's little boy deserved protection from the woman who was systematically destroying his family. Elena picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd saved earlier. Marcus Rivera, Pacific Northwest Today. Her finger hovered over the call button for nearly 5 minutes before she finally pressed it. Margaret stared at the paperwork spread across her hospital bed tray, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she tried to focus on the dense legal language. David sat beside her, his expression carefully neutral as he explained why the power of attorney documents were necessary. "It's just a precaution, Mom, until you're fully recovered and can handle your own affairs again." The words were reasonable, but Margaret could hear Jessica's influence in them. This was another step in the systematic removal of her autonomy, disguised as practical planning. "David, I'm recovering from a broken hip, not dementia. I can still make my own decisions." "Of course you can. But what if something happens while you're in rehabilitation? What if there are medical decisions that need to be made quickly, or financial issues that can't wait?" Margaret recognized the logic. It was the same reasoning Jessica had used to convince David that his mother needed supervision after her heart episode. Every concern was legitimate on its surface, but taken together, they created a framework for complete control. "Where is this coming from, David? Yesterday you were asking about my physical therapy progress. Today, you want me to sign over my legal rights." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Jessica pointed out that we should have had these arrangements in place before your accident. If you'd been more seriously injured, if you'd been unconscious, longer." Jessica suggested this. "She's thinking ahead, trying to protect you. And honestly, Mom, some of the things you've been saying about her, the accusations, they're concerning. The stress of your recovery might be affecting your judgment." Margaret felt the familiar chill of gaslighting, the way Jessica could turn Margaret's own claims of abuse into evidence of mental instability. Now she was using David as a proxy, having him question his mother's competence while maintaining the appearance of loving concern. "My judgment is fine, David. What's concerning is that you're asking me to sign legal documents based on your wife's recommendation, when your wife is the person who put me in this hospital bed." David's face flushed. "Mom, please don't start with that again." Tommy was confused about what he saw. Tommy told the truth. You know he did. You saw his face when he described what happened. Children can misinterpret adult interactions, especially when they're frightened or upset. Jessica explained that to me. Jessica explained. Margaret set down her reading glasses and looked directly at her son. "David, when did you stop trusting your own perceptions? When did Jessica's explanations become more reliable than your own observations?" The question hung between them like a challenge. For a moment, Margaret saw something flicker in David's eyes. Doubt, recognition, the beginning of understanding. But then his defensive walls went back up. "I trust Jessica because she's my wife, because she loves our family, because she's been taking care of you for 6 months without complaint. She's been manipulating me for 6 months, and now she's manipulating you into thinking I'm incompetent so she can control my finances and medical decisions." David stood abruptly, gathering the unsigned papers from her bed tray. "I think we should table this discussion until you're feeling more like yourself." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Margaret watched her son leave, carrying documents that would strip away her autonomy if she were ever vulnerable enough, or isolated enough, for Jessica to convince him to use them. Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway as David's footsteps faded down the hallway. "How did that go?" "She's moving faster than I expected. The power of attorney, the questions about my mental competence. She's trying to legally declare me incapacitated." Dr. Patel entered the room and closed the door behind her. "Which is why I needed to show you this." She pulled out her tablet and navigated to a medical database. "I've been reviewing your prescription history, cross-referencing it with the symptoms Jessica described in her interviews." Margaret leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "According to Jessica, you've been experiencing dizziness and confusion due to interactions between your blood pressure medication and your heart medication. But look at this." Dr. Patel highlighted a section of text. "These 2 medications have been safely prescribed together for decades. The interaction she described doesn't exist. I consulted with 3 different pharmacologists to confirm." Margaret felt a surge of vindication mixed with horror. "She lied about my medical condition." More than that, she created a fictional, medical explanation for symptoms you weren't experiencing, then used that fiction to convince your doctors to adjust your medications unnecessarily, making me actually dizzy and confused. Exactly. She was chemically gaslighting you, using the medical system as a weapon. Margaret stared at the evidence on the screen, trying to process the level of calculation and cruelty it represented. Jessica hadn't just been manipulating family dynamics, she'd been orchestrating medical abuse, convincing doctors to alter Margaret's prescriptions based on fabricated symptoms. "How many other patients has she done this to?" Margaret asked, quietly. "That's what I'm afraid to find out," Dr. Patel replied. "Mrs. Chen, I think your daughter-in-law is more dangerous than any of us realized, and I think Marcus Rivera's investigation is going to uncover some very disturbing truths." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Found Jessica's former roommate. She wants to talk. Can you meet tomorrow afternoon?" Margaret showed the message to Dr. Patel, who smiled grimly. "Jessica's house of cards is about to collapse. She won't go down without a fight," Margaret warned. "And she's proven she's willing to hurt anyone who threatens her." Dr. Patel's expression grew determined. "Then we'd better make sure we have enough evidence to stop her before she hurts anyone else." Outside Margaret's window, Portland's skyline glittered in the afternoon sun, indifferent to the personal dramas playing out in its hospitals and homes. But Margaret felt something shifting in the balance of power that had seemed so hopelessly tilted in Jessica's favor. The truth was gathering momentum, and soon even Jessica's formidable manipulative skills might not be enough to contain it. Elena Vasquez sat across from Marcus Rivera in a corner booth at Powell's Books Cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The ambient noise of conversations and coffee machines provided cover for their discussion, but Elena still found herself glancing nervously toward the entrance every few minutes. "I keep thinking she's going to walk through that door," Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been 2 years since we spoke, but I still feel like she's watching me." Marcus leaned forward, his recorder positioned discreetly. Between them, "Tell me about when you first met Jessica." "College, Portland State, fall of 2018. She was my roommate in the dorms." Elena's expression softened with memory. She was charming, funny, incredibly smart. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room when she focused on you. What was her background? Foster care. Her parents lost custody when she was 12. Drug addiction, neglect. She'd been through 7 different placements before aging out of the system. I felt sorry for her at first, wanted to help. Marcus made notes, recognizing the pattern. Vulnerable targets often became Jessica's strongest defenders initially, their compassion making them blind to the manipulation. "When did you start noticing problems?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into her tea. "It was subtle at first. She'd borrow my clothes without asking, then act hurt when I mentioned it. Like I was being petty for caring about material things when she'd had so little growing up. Classic boundary testing." "Exactly. But I didn't see it that way then. I felt guilty for being upset about small things when she'd survived such trauma." Elena shook her head. She was brilliant at using her past to deflect accountability. Marcus thought about Margaret's descriptions of Jessica's behavior, the way she positioned herself as a devoted caregiver while systematically undermining Margaret's autonomy. "How did it escalate?" "Money, first. She'd ask to borrow $20 for groceries, then never mention paying it back. When I finally brought it up, she'd act confused, say she'd already paid me back, make me question my own memory." Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled through old text messages. "I started keeping records after a while, screenshots of our conversations. Look at this." She showed Marcus a text thread from 2019. Jessica had borrowed $150 for textbooks, promising to pay it back within a week. When Elena asked about it 2 weeks later, Jessica's response was accusatory. "I can't believe you're keeping track of money when you know how hard things are for me right now. I thought we were friends." She turned your reasonable request into an attack on her character, Marcus observed. "Every time. And somehow I always ended up apologizing, promising to be more understanding." Elena's voice carried the frustration of someone who'd finally seen through years of manipulation. "She... feeling more like yourself?" The dismissal was gentle, but absolute. Margaret watched her son leave, carrying documents that would strip away her autonomy if she were ever vulnerable enough, or isolated enough, for Jessica to convince him to use them. Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway as David's footsteps faded down the hallway. "How did that go?" "She's moving faster than I expected. The power of attorney, the questions about my mental competence, she's trying to legally declare me incapacitated." Dr. Patel entered the room and closed the door behind her. "Which is why I needed to show you this." She pulled out her tablet and navigated to a medical database. "I've been reviewing your prescription history, cross-referencing it with the symptoms Jessica described in her interviews." Margaret leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "According to Jessica, you've been experiencing dizziness and confusion due to interactions between your blood pressure medication and your heart medication. But look at this." Dr. Patel highlighted a section of text. "These 2 medications have been safely prescribed together for decades. The interaction she described doesn't exist. I consulted with 3 different pharmacologists to confirm." Margaret felt a surge of vindication mixed with horror. She lied about my medical condition. More than that, she created a fictional, medical explanation for symptoms you weren't experiencing, then used that fiction to convince your doctors to adjust your medications unnecessarily, making me actually dizzy and confused. Exactly. She was chemically gaslighting you, using the medical system as a weapon. Margaret stared at the evidence on the screen, trying to process the level of calculation and cruelty it represented. Jessica hadn't just been manipulating family dynamics. She'd been orchestrating medical abuse, convincing doctors to alter Margaret's prescriptions based on fabricated symptoms, was dating this guy, Kevin, during our sophomore year. Sweet kid. Pre-med student. Jessica convinced him that his study group was excluding her, that they looked down on her because of her background. Was that true? Not at all. I knew people in that study group. They'd tried to include her, but she'd show up unprepared or start arguments about irrelevant topics. When they stopped inviting her, she spun it as class discrimination. Marcus recognized the pattern from Robert Henley's account. She isolated him from his academic support network. Completely. Kevin's grades started slipping because he was spending all his time comforting Jessica instead of studying. When he finally realized what was happening and tried to end the relationship, she threatened to report him for academic misconduct. Did she have evidence of misconduct? Elena's laugh was bitter. She didn't need evidence. She'd convinced him that his study group was cheating, that he was complicit by association. Even though it wasn't true, Kevin was terrified of the accusation following him through medical school. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same psychological terrorism that Jessica was now using against Margaret, creating consequences so severe that the victim would rather endure the abuse than risk the threatened retaliation. How did that relationship end? Kevin transferred schools, changed his entire life plan to get away from her. And Jessica? She acted like she was the victim, like she'd been abandoned by someone she loved. She actually got sympathy from people who didn't know the whole story. Elena paused to sip her cold tea, gathering courage for what came next. That's when I should have seen who she really was, but I was her best friend, her roommate. I felt responsible for her. Tell me about David. Elena's expression grew pained. She met him at a coffee shop near campus in early 2021. He was going through a rough patch. His father had died the year before. He was struggling with work stress, feeling isolated. Perfect target. You met him? Several times. He's a good man, Marcus. Genuinely kind, wants to help people. Jessica presented their relationship as this beautiful love story, how he'd rescued her from loneliness, given her the stability she'd never had. But you saw something different? I saw the same patterns. Within months, David stopped hanging out with his friends. Jessica always had reasons why they couldn't make social plans. She was feeling anxious or tired, or David needed to help her with something. She moved in with him after 6 months, quit her job because the stress was affecting her health. Marcus thought about Margaret's account of Jessica's manipulation. She made herself completely dependent on him, while simultaneously making him dependent on her approval. She'd manufacture crises that only David could solve, then reward him with affection when he dropped everything to help her. It was textbook trauma bonding. Elena pulled out another phone screenshot. This is from right before their wedding. I tried to talk to David privately, express some concerns about how fast things were moving. The message showed Jessica's response when she found out about the conversation. I can't believe Elena would try to sabotage our happiness. I thought she was my friend, but she's clearly jealous that I found love. It hurts so much that someone I trusted would try to poison David against me. She turned your concern into betrayal, Marcus said, and made David choose between his fiancé and his doubts. He chose her, obviously. Cut off contact with me completely. Elena's voice cracked slightly. I lost my best friend because I tried to protect her husband from her. Marcus studied Elena's face, seeing the genuine pain of someone who'd tried to do the right thing and been punished for it. Why are you talking to me now? What changed? Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out the cafe window at the Portland street scene. I've been watching the news coverage, seeing how she's positioning herself as the victim, and I keep thinking about Margaret Chen, lying in that hospital bed, probably feeling as crazy and isolated as I felt when Jessica was gaslighting me. But you're taking a risk by coming forward. Jessica's already contacted you. Elena's hand went instinctively to her phone. That email scared me, but it also made me angry. She's still trying to control people through intimidation, still using fear to keep her secrets safe. What can you tell me about her relationship with Margaret? Jessica hated her from the beginning, not Margaret specifically, but what she represented, David's primary emotional attachment before their marriage. Jessica couldn't tolerate divided loyalty. Elena leaned forward, her voice growing more urgent. Marcus, you have to understand something about Jessica. She doesn't just want to be loved, she needs to be the only source of love in her partner's life. Anyone who threatens that monopoly becomes an enemy. Including an 8-year-old child? Especially a child. Children are perceptive, harder to manipulate than adults. Tommy probably saw through Jessica's act from the beginning, which made him dangerous to her. Marcus thought about Tommy's testimony, the way Jessica had tried to convince him that his own memories were unreliable. She tried to gaslight an 8-year-old. She'll gaslight anyone who threatens her narrative. The age doesn't matter. The relationship doesn't matter. Jessica's survival depends on controlling how people perceive reality. Marcus closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. Elena, I'm going to write this story. Jessica's going to know it came from you. I know. Elena's voice was steadier now, resolved. But Margaret Chen deserves the truth. And maybe if enough people understand Jessica's pattern, she won't be able to do this to anyone else. As they prepared to leave, Elena touched Marcus's arm. Be careful. Jessica's dangerous when she feels cornered, and she's about to feel very cornered. 3 days later, Marcus's article appeared on the front page of Pacific Northwest Today's website, under the headline, The Pattern. Former friend reveals history of manipulation in viral fall case. Margaret read it from her hospital bed with Dr. Patel beside her, both women absorbing the detailed account of Jessica's behavior patterns. Elena's testimony provided crucial context for everything Margaret had experienced: the systematic isolation, the gaslighting, the way Jessica turned, victims' own compassion against them. She's done this before, Margaret said quietly. Kevin, Robert, Elena herself. I'm just the latest target. Dr. Patel scrolled through the comments section, which was already exploding with responses. Look at this. People are starting to see through her performance. The comments ranged from shock to validation from other abuse survivors who recognized the patterns Elena described. But there were also defenders, people who accused Elena of jealousy, who insisted that Jessica's emotional interviews proved her innocence. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting their review. David's name appeared on the screen. Hi, sweetheart, Margaret answered, bracing herself for another difficult conversation. Mom, have you seen the news today? David's voice was strained, carrying a tension Margaret hadn't heard since the day of her fall. The article about Elena? Yes, I read it. It's pretty damaging to Jessica. Some of the things Elena claims she did. Margaret heard the uncertainty in her son's voice, the first real crack in his faith in his wife. David, Elena is telling the truth. Everything she described about Jessica's behavior, I've seen it firsthand. But why would Elena come forward? Now? Why wait until all this media attention to make these claims? Because she was afraid. The same way I was afraid to tell you what really happened on those stairs. Jessica is very good at making people afraid to speak against her. There was a long pause. When David spoke again, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. When you lived with us, did she do the things Elena described? The manipulation? The isolation attempts? Margaret closed her eyes, recognizing this as a crucial moment. David was finally ready to hear the truth, but she needed to be careful not to overwhelm him with accusations he wasn't ready to process. Yes, David, she did. She convinced you I was having balance problems I wasn't experiencing. She manipulated my medical appointments to create a false narrative about my health. She systematically tried to damage my relationship with Tommy and with you. But why? What did she gain from any of that? Control, David. Jessica needs to be the center of your emotional universe. As long as I was in your life, as long as Tommy loved me, she couldn't have complete control over your family. David was quiet for so long that Margaret worried the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I've been so stupid, haven't I? I've been protecting her while she was hurting you. You've been manipulated by someone who's very skilled at manipulation. That doesn't make you stupid, David. It makes you human. What do I do now, Mom? How do I fix this? Before Margaret could answer, she heard Jessica's voice in the background, sharp and urgent. David, who are you talking to? Is that about the article? Don't believe anything Elena says. She's always been jealous of our relationship. Margaret heard David's sharp intake of breath as Jessica's words provided real-time demonstration of the manipulation tactics Elena had described. The timing was so perfect it was almost comical, Jessica inserting herself into the conversation, immediately dismissing Elena's credibility, positioning herself as the victim of jealousy. I have to go, Mom, David said quietly. But we need to talk more. Soon. After he hung up, Margaret turned to Dr. Patel with a mixture of hope and trepidation. I think David is finally starting to see the truth. Which means Jessica is about to escalate, Dr. Patel warned. When manipulators lose control of their primary target, they usually become more aggressive, more desperate. As if to prove her point, Margaret's phone buzzed with a news alert. Jessica had scheduled an emergency press conference for that afternoon, promising to address the vicious lies being spread by people with personal vendettas. Dr. Patel showed Margaret her own phone, which displayed a GoFundMe page with Jessica's photo prominently featured. Help the Chen family, supporting Margaret's recovery and fighting false accusations. The page had already raised $12,000 in 6 hours. She's monetizing her victim narrative, Margaret said in disbelief. And using your medical situation to generate sympathy donations that go directly to her account, Dr. Patel added grimly. Margaret stared at the fundraising page, seeing her own fall turned into a profit center for the woman who had pushed her down the stairs. The violation was complete. Jessica wasn't just stealing Margaret's autonomy and family relationships, she was literally profiting from the assault. Dr. Patel, Margaret said with quiet determination, I think it's time to call Adult Protective Services. Dr. Patel nodded and pulled out her phone. I've been documenting everything, the medical manipulation, the psychological abuse patterns, the financial exploitation. We have enough evidence to open a formal investigation. As Dr. Patel made the call, Margaret watched Jessica's press conference announcement scroll across her phone screen. The war for truth was about to enter a new phase, one where legal institutions would be forced to choose between Jessica's compelling performance and the mounting evidence of her systematic abuse. Margaret felt a mixture of fear and determination. Jessica was cornered now, and cornered manipulators were dangerous. But for the first time since her fall, Margaret wasn't fighting alone. She had allies, evidence, and most importantly, she Had David beginning to question the woman who had spent 3 years rewriting his reality? The truth was surfacing, piece by piece, witness by witness. Soon, even Jessica's formidable manipulative skills might not be enough to contain it. Judge Patricia Wong had seen enough elder abuse cases in her 23 years on the bench to recognize the signs before the first witness even spoke. The way Margaret Chen gripped her wheelchair's armrests when Jessica entered the courtroom. The calculated composure of the younger woman's expression. The nervous energy radiating from David Chen as he sat between his mother and wife, literally caught in the middle. But Judge Wong also understood that recognizing patterns wasn't the same as proving facts. The law required evidence, testimony, documentation, things that could be challenged, cross-examined, verified. And Jessica Martinez-Chen had hired the kind of attorney who specialized in creating reasonable doubt about unreasonable situations. Your Honor, Attorney Richard Kellerman stood at his table, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd defended the indefensible many times before. My client stands accused of elder abuse based on a viral video that has been taken completely out of context by social media vigilantes and ambitious journalists seeking clickbait content. Margaret watched Kellerman pace before the bench, recognizing his strategy immediately. He wasn't just defending Jessica. He was attacking the credibility of everyone who opposed her. The social media vigilantes were people who'd seen the security footage and believed their own eyes. The ambitious journalist was Marcus Rivera, whose careful documentation of Jessica's pattern of abuse had provided crucial evidence for this hearing. The facts are simple, Kellerman continued. Mrs. Margaret Chen is a 77-year-old woman with documented heart problems and medication issues who tragically fell downstairs in her son's home. The security footage shows my client attempting to assist Mrs. Chen, not assault her. What we're witnessing is a family tragedy being exploited by people with ulterior motives. Dr. Patel leaned forward in the gallery, her expression tight with controlled anger. She'd spent hours preparing medical documentation that contradicted every aspect of Kellerman's narrative, but she knew that defense attorneys were skilled at making facts seem negotiable. Judge Wong turned to Margaret's attorney, Sarah Martinez from the Portland Legal Aid Society. Ms. Martinez, present your opening statement. Thank you, Your Honor. This case is about a systematic pattern of abuse, manipulation, and financial exploitation that culminated in the defendant physically assaulting my client. We will present medical evidence, witness testimony, and documentation showing that Jessica Martinez-Chen has been systematically isolating, gaslighting, and financially exploiting Margaret Chen for months, with the ultimate goal of gaining control over her assets and removing her from her son's life. The difference in approach was stark. Kellerman had focused on discrediting the opposition. Martinez was promising evidence. The security footage is clear and unambiguous, Martinez continued. It shows the defendant deliberately blocking Mrs. Chen's path, engaging in a physical confrontation, and pushing her down a flight of stairs. But more importantly, it shows the immediate aftermath. How quickly the defendant transformed from aggressor to concerned caregiver, already beginning the performance that would define her media appearances. Jessica sat perfectly still throughout. Both opening statements, her face a mask of composed sadness. But Margaret caught the micro-expressions that flickered across her features when Martinez mentioned the financial exploitation. A tightening around her eyes that suggested genuine fear. Judge Wong called the first witness. Dr. Sarah Patel, please take the stand. Dr. Patel was sworn in and settled into the witness chair with the calm authority of someone who'd testified in court before. Her credentials were impeccable. 15 years of experience, specialization in elder care, recognition as an expert in detecting abuse patterns. Dr. Patel, Martinez began, what was your initial assessment of Mrs. Chen's condition when you first met her? Mrs. Chen presented with a fractured hip consistent with a fall from height, but her cognitive function was excellent. Her muscle tone was good for her age, and she showed no signs of the balance disorders or medication confusion that had been reported by family members. Kellerman objected. Hearsay, Your Honor. The witness cannot testify about what was reported by others. Sustained. Dr. Patel, please limit your testimony to your direct observations. Dr. Patel nodded smoothly. Based on my direct examination, Mrs. Chen showed no physical indicators of chronic balance problems. Her reflexes were normal, her coordination was appropriate for her age, and her mental acuity was sharp. These findings were inconsistent with the medical narrative I had been given. What medical narrative? That Mrs. Chen had been experiencing dizziness, confusion, and balance problems due to medication interactions, and that these issues had been ongoing for several weeks prior to her fall. Margaret watched Jessica's face as Dr. Patel systematically dismantled the story Jessica had sold to the media. For the first time since the hearings began, Jessica's composure seemed to waver slightly. Dr. Patel, did you have occasion to review Mrs. Chen's prescription history? I did. I consulted with 3 pharmacologists to analyze potential interactions between her medications. The drug combination Mrs. Chen was taking has been safely prescribed together for decades. The interactions described by family members do not exist in medical literature. Kellerman rose for cross-examination, his strategy immediately apparent. Dr. Patel, how long have you known Mrs. Chen? Approximately 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, you formed definitive opinions about her medical history, her family dynamics, and the accuracy of reports from people who've known her for years. Dr. Patel's voice remained steady. I've formed professional medical opinions based on examination, testing, and documented evidence. But you weren't present on the night of Mrs. Chen's fall, were you? You didn't witness the incident yourself. No, I did not. So, your testimony about what happened that night is speculation, isn't it? My testimony is about Mrs. Chen's physical condition, which contradicts claims that her fall was caused by chronic health issues. Margaret felt a surge of admiration for Dr. Patel's composure under attack. Kellerman was skilled, but he couldn't make medical evidence disappear through aggressive questioning. The next witness was Marcus Rivera, whose investigation had uncovered the pattern of Jessica's previous relationships. Kellerman's attack on him was more vicious, questioning his motives, his methods, even his competence as a journalist. Mr. Rivera, isn't it true that you've written multiple articles about this case? Articles that have generated significant web traffic and social media engagement for your publication? Yes, the case has received attention. And isn't it true? That controversy sells, Mr. Rivera. That sensational accusations generate more clicks than boring truth? Marcus looked directly at Kellerman. What generates clicks is compelling evidence of systematic abuse. The truth in this case happens to be sensational. Judge Wong called for a recess, and Margaret was wheeled out to the courthouse lobby, where a media circus awaited. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and protesters held signs reading both "Justice for Margaret" and "Stop the Witch Hunt." David approached her wheelchair, his face haggard with exhaustion and confusion. Mom, I don't know what to think anymore. You don't have to think, David. You just have to listen to the evidence. But Jessica's attorney is making good points about the inconsistencies, about the motivations of people coming forward now. Margaret felt her heart sink. Even here, even with medical testimony and documented evidence, David was still searching for ways to doubt what he was hearing. David, she said gently, what does your gut tell you? Forget the lawyers. Forget the media attention. When you watch that security footage, what do you see? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the courthouse floor. I see my wife pushing my mother down the stairs, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Then trust that, Margaret said. Trust what you see, not what you're being told to see. When court resumed, Judge Wong called Jessica to testify on her own behalf. This was the moment Margaret had been both dreading and anticipating. Jessica's opportunity to perform for a judge who couldn't be charmed or manipulated through television interviews. Jessica took the stand with perfect composure, her voice steady as she recounted her version of events. She spoke about her love for Margaret, her concern for the elderly woman's safety, her heartbreak at being accused of deliberately harming someone she considered a mother figure. But something was different. Without the controlled environment of a television studio, without the ability to edit or reshoot, Jessica's performance felt slightly off. Her timing was too perfect, her emotions too calculated. Judge Wong watched, with the expression of someone who'd heard similar testimony from skilled manipulators many times before. "Mrs. Martinez-Chen," Judge Wong said during a break in questioning, "I'd like to ask you about the GoFundMe account you established for Mrs. Chen's medical expenses." Jessica's lawyer started to object, but Judge Wong cut him off. "This goes to the question of financial exploitation, which is part of the protective order request. I started the fundraiser to help with Margaret's medical costs," Jessica said smoothly. "The bills were mounting, and I wanted to help." "Are you aware that Mrs. Chen has comprehensive health insurance that covers her hospitalization and rehabilitation?" For the first time, Jessica hesitated. The insurance doesn't cover everything." According to hospital records, Mrs. Chen's out-of-pocket expenses total less than $3,000. Your fundraiser has collected over $40,000. Where is that money? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Margaret watched Jessica's face as the judge's question exposed the financial fraud that had been hidden beneath her performance of caring concern. "The money is being held until we determine what additional expenses might arise," Jessica said. Finally, "In an account controlled exclusively by you?" Yes, but only to help Margaret." Judge Wong made a note, and Margaret saw something shift in the courtroom's energy. The question of financial exploitation had revealed something that Jessica's performance couldn't cover: greed disguised as charity. As the day's testimony concluded, Margaret felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The legal process was grueling, but it was also revealing truth in a way that media coverage couldn't. Jessica's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble under the weight of evidence and the scrutiny of a judge who couldn't be manipulated. But Margaret also knew that Jessica wouldn't surrender easily. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more evidence, and more opportunities for Jessica to try to regain control of the narrative. The battle for truth was far from over, but for the first time since her fall, Margaret felt like she might actually win. The most difficult moment in Judge Patricia Wong's career came when she had to explain to an 8-year-old boy why grown-ups sometimes lie about important things. Tommy Chen sat in the witness chair, his legs dangling several inches from the floor, wearing his best school clothes and clutching a small stuffed dinosaur that the court had allowed him to bring for comfort. "Tommy," Judge Wong said gently, "do you understand that I'm a judge? And that means I help people figure out what really happened when there's a disagreement?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "Like when kids at school say different things about who started the fight?" "Exactly like that. Sometimes adults disagree about what happened too, and we need to find out the truth." Margaret watched her grandson from her wheelchair in the gallery, her heart breaking at the burden being placed on such small shoulders. David sat beside her, his face pale with the knowledge that his son was about to testify against his stepmother. Jessica remained at the defendant's table, but her usual composure had been replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Tommy, Judge." Wong continued, "You know that telling the truth is very important, right? Even if the truth might make someone sad or upset?" "Yes, ma'am. Grandma Maggie says the truth is like medicine. Sometimes it tastes bad, but it makes things better." Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the simple wisdom of her grandson's words. Sarah Martinez, Margaret's attorney, approached the witness. "Stand with careful gentleness. Tommy, do you remember the night when Grandma Maggie got hurt?" "Yes, I was supposed to be in bed, but I got thirsty and came downstairs for water." "What did you see when you came downstairs?" Tommy's voice was clear and certain. the way children speak when they're simply reporting what they observed without the filters of adult interpretation. I saw Jessica and Grandma Maggie at the top of the stairs. They were talking, but not nice talking. Mad talking. Could you hear what they were saying? Jessica was saying mean things. She said Grandma Maggie was trying to ruin her family, and that she wished Grandma Maggie would just go away and leave them alone. Jessica's attorney immediately objected. Your Honor, this is hearsay from a child who may not accurately remember. Overruled, Judge Wong said sharply. The witness is describing his direct observations. Continue, Tommy. What happened next? Martinez asked. Tommy's small face scrunched with concentration. Grandma Maggie tried to walk away, but Jessica stepped in front of her. Like when kids block you in the hallway at school so you can't pass. Then what happened? Grandma Maggie said, Jessica, please move. But Jessica didn't move. She put her hands on Grandma Maggie's arms. Tommy demonstrated with his own small hands, showing a gripping motion. And then she pushed. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Tommy? Martinez said gently. Did Grandma Maggie fall down? By accident? Or did Jessica push her? Jessica pushed her. I saw it. Tommy's voice carried the absolute certainty of childhood observation, untainted by adult rationalization or doubt. After Grandma Maggie fell, Jessica ran down the stairs really fast and started yelling for Daddy. Jessica's attorney rose for cross-examination, but his usual aggressive approach softened in the face of the child witness. Tommy, it was dark that night, wasn't it? Maybe you didn't see everything clearly. The hallway light was on. I could see everything. Sometimes when we're scared or upset, we remember things differently than they really happened. I remember exactly what happened, Tommy interrupted with the stubbornness that Margaret recognized from his father. Jessica pushed Grandma Maggie down the stairs on purpose because she was mad at her. But Tommy, why didn't you tell anyone about this right away? For the first time, Tommy's confidence wavered slightly. I was scared. Jessica told me that sometimes people see things that aren't real when they're tired, and that I might get in trouble if I said things that weren't true. Margaret felt rage course through her as she realized Jessica had gaslighted an 8-year-old child, making him doubt his own perceptions to protect her secret. She said if I told stories about grown-ups, I might have to go live somewhere else, away from Daddy. Tommy's voice was smaller now. I didn't want to go away. Judge Wong's expression had grown increasingly stern throughout Tommy's testimony. When the child was dismissed, she called for a brief recess, but Margaret could see the impact of his words written across everyone's faces. During the break, David approached Margaret's wheelchair, his face haggard with grief and shame. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to him from the beginning. She threatened him, David. She made an 8-year-old afraid to tell the truth about what he witnessed. I know. David's voice broke. How did I not see what she was doing? How did I let her manipulate all of us like this? Margaret reached for her son's hand. Because she's very good at what she does, and because you loved her. Love makes us vulnerable to people who know how to exploit it. When court resumed, Dr. Michael Reeves took the stand. As a forensic pharmacologist with 30 years of experience, his testimony was designed to definitively address Jessica's claims about Margaret's medication-induced confusion. Dr. Reeves, Martinez began, you've reviewed Mrs. Chen's complete prescription history and medical records. In your expert opinion, could the medication she was taking have caused the dizziness, confusion, and balance problems that were reported? Absolutely not. Mrs. Chen was taking lisinopril for blood pressure and metoprolol for her heart condition. These medications have been safely prescribed together for decades. The interaction described by the defendant does not exist in medical literature. Is there any combination of Mrs. Chen's prescribed medications that could cause the symptoms Jessica Martinez-Chen described in her media interviews? None whatsoever. In fact, Mrs. Chen's medication regimen was conservative and appropriate for someone her age. Any physician would recognize these as safe, standard prescriptions. Jessica's attorney attempted to challenge the testimony by suggesting that individual reactions could vary, but Dr. Reeves was unshakable. Mr. Kellerman, pharmaceutical interactions are not matters of opinion. They're documented, studied, and well understood. The defendant's claims about medication-induced confusion are medically impossible, given Mrs. Chen's prescription history. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rivera had convinced the court to allow a detailed analysis of the security footage by a video forensics expert who could break down the timing and movements frame by frame. Expert witness Dr. Jennifer Walsh displayed enlarged screenshots from the security camera on a large monitor. If we examine the footage moment by moment, we can see that Mrs. Martinez-Chen's account of the incident contains several factual impossibilities. She clicked through a series of frames. Here, at timestamp 23:47:015, we see Mrs. Chen attempting to move past Mrs. Martinez-Chen. Mrs. Martinez-Chen's positioning is clearly blocking Mrs. Chen's path. The next frames showed the confrontation escalating. At 23:47:22, Mrs. Martinez-Chen makes contact with Mrs. Chen's arms. The force and direction of movement is clearly outward, not supportive or protective. The final devastating frame showed the moment of impact. At 23:47:24, Mrs. Martinez-Chen's hands make contact with Mrs. Chen's upper body. The trajectory and force are consistent with a deliberate push, not an attempt to catch or assist someone who was falling. Dr. Walsh's analysis demolished any remaining doubt about the nature of the incident. The security footage didn't just contradict Jessica's story, it proved she had lied about every aspect of what happened. When Jessica was recalled to the stand for further questioning, the careful composure that had characterized her previous testimony was gone. Sarah Martinez's questions were precise and devastating. Mrs. Martinez-Chen, you testified that you were trying to help Mrs. Chen when she fell. Is that still your testimony? Yes, I was trying to catch her. But the video analysis shows you pushing her, not catching her. How do you explain that? Jessica's voice rose slightly. The expert is misinterpreting what she's seeing. I was reaching out to steady Margaret. Mrs. Martinez-Chen, you also testified that Mrs. Chen's fall was caused by medication-induced dizziness. Are you aware that expert testimony has established that her medications could not cause such symptoms? Doctors can be wrong. I saw what I saw. What you saw was convenient for your narrative, wasn't it? A narrative that painted you as a devoted caregiver and Mrs. Chen as a confused elderly woman? Jessica's attorney objected, but the damage was being done. Under the sustained pressure of cross-examination, Jessica's performance began to crack. Mrs. Martinez-Chen, let's talk about the GoFundMe account you established. You've collected over $40,000 in donations supposedly for Mrs. Chen's medical expenses. Where is that money? It's being held for Margaret's care, in an account that only you control, despite the fact that Mrs. Chen's actual medical expenses are fully covered by insurance. I was trying to help. By collecting money under false pretenses, by using Mrs. Chen's injury as a source of personal income. That was when Jessica finally broke. The careful mask of concerned daughter-in-law shattered completely, revealing the calculating manipulator beneath. She deserved it, Jessica's voice cracked with rage. She was trying to destroy my marriage, turn my husband against me, undermine everything I'd built. The courtroom erupted. Jessica's attorney frantically tried to control his client, but she was beyond listening. I gave David everything. I made him happy. I took care of his house. I loved his son. But it was never enough because Precious. Margaret was always there, always judging me, always making him doubt. Margaret watched in fascination and horror as Jessica revealed her true nature. This was the woman who had been living in her son's house, caring for her grandson, systematically destroying her family while wearing a mask of loving devotion. She wouldn't leave. She wouldn't just go to assisted living and let us be a family. So yes, I pushed her. I pushed her because she was ruining my life. Judge Wong's gavel silenced the courtroom, but Jessica's confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. In her rage, she had admitted to everything: the deliberate assault, the financial fraud, the systematic manipulation of her family. When Margaret was finally called to testify about the impact of Jessica's abuse, she felt a strange sense of calm. The truth was finally out. Jessica's mask had fallen away completely, revealing the predator who had been systematically destroying their family. "Your Honor," Margaret said from her wheelchair, her voice steady and clear. "Jessica Martinez-Chen didn't just push me down. The stairs. She spent months pushing me out of my own family. She isolated me from my son, manipulated my medical care, and made me doubt my own perceptions and memories." Margaret looked directly at Jessica, who was now slumped in her chair, the fight gone out of her. But the worst part wasn't what she did to me. It was what she did to my grandson. She made an 8-year-old child afraid to tell the truth because she threatened to take away everyone he loved. "Mrs. Chen," Judge Wong said gently, "what outcome are you seeking from these proceedings? I want a protective order that keeps Jessica away from my family permanently. I want the money she stole through fraud returned to its donors. And I want my son and grandson to be safe from someone who has proven she's willing to hurt children to protect her lies." Margaret paused, gathering her strength for her final words. "Your Honor, Jessica didn't just assault me physically. She assaulted the truth itself over and over again, until even an innocent child was afraid to say what he had seen. That's not just elder abuse. That's an attack on the very foundation of trust that families depend on." As Margaret was wheeled back to her place in the gallery, she caught David's eye. Her son's face was wet with tears, but for the first time in months, she saw recognition there, not confusion or conflicted loyalty, but clear understanding of what his wife had done to their family. The truth had finally emerged, devastating and complete. Jessica's carefully constructed fantasy had been demolished by the testimony of an 8-year-old boy who simply told the truth, medical experts who couldn't be fooled by fictional symptoms, and video evidence that couldn't be manipulated or explained away. Now it was up to Judge Wong to decide what justice looked like when the truth was so much worse than anyone had initially imagined. Judge Patricia Wong entered the courtroom at precisely 2:00 p.m., her expression grave as she settled behind the bench. The gallery was packed with media representatives, family members, and observers who had followed the case since Marcus Rivera's first article. Margaret sat in her wheelchair in the front row, flanked by Dr. Patel and her attorney, while David held Tommy's hand nearby. Jessica sat rigid at the defendant's table, her attorney whispering urgent last-minute instructions that she seemed unable to hear. The confident woman who had charmed television audiences just weeks earlier had been replaced by someone whose carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. "Before I render my decision," Judge Wong began, "I want to address the broader implications of this case. Elder abuse often occurs in the shadows, perpetrated by those trusted to provide care. When that abuse involves sophisticated psychological manipulation, it becomes even more insidious and difficult to detect." Margaret felt her heart racing as the judge's words confirmed what she had hoped, that her suffering had been recognized not just as a personal tragedy, but as part of a larger pattern of abuse that needed legal intervention. The evidence presented in this case is overwhelming and disturbing. The testimony of Tommy Chen, though difficult to hear from one so young, was credible, consistent, and supported by video evidence. The medical testimony definitively contradicts the defendant's claims about Mrs. Chen's health status. revealing a pattern of medical manipulation that constitutes abuse in its own right. Judge Wong's voice grew sharper as she continued. The video analysis removes any doubt about the nature of the physical altercation. Mrs. Martinez-Chen did not attempt to assist Mrs. Chen. She deliberately pushed her down a flight of stairs, then immediately began constructing a false narrative about the incident. Jessica's face had gone pale, but she remained motionless as the judge systematically dismantled her defense. Perhaps most troubling is the evidence of financial exploitation through the GoFundMe account, which demonstrates a willingness to profit from the very injury the defendant caused. This shows a level of calculation and callousness that goes beyond momentary anger or poor judgment. Margaret watched David's face as he absorbed the full legal validation of what his 8-year-old son had tried to tell him from the beginning. The pain in her son's expression was heartbreaking, but she also saw relief. The relief of finally understanding the truth. Therefore, I am granting the protective order in full. Jessica Martinez-Chen is hereby ordered to maintain no contact with Margaret Chen directly or indirectly for a period of 5 years. She is further ordered to surrender any financial control over Mrs. Chen's affairs and to return all funds collected through fraudulent fundraising to the appropriate authorities for distribution to the donors. The gavel came down with finality that echoed through the silent courtroom. That's when Jessica snapped. "This is insane!" she screamed, jumping to her feet and overturning her chair. "She's a manipulative old woman who turned my own family against me. I gave David everything, and she destroyed it." Bailiffs moved quickly toward the defendant's table as Jessica's attorney tried unsuccessfully to restrain his client. "I should have pushed her harder," Jessica shrieked, her face contorted with rage. "I should have made sure she couldn't come back and ruin my life." The threat hung in the air as security officers approached. Jessica's final outburst had sealed her fate more completely than any testimony could have. Within hours, the verdict became national news. Margaret found herself vindicated not just in court, but in the court of public opinion that had initially painted her as a confused elderly woman whose family drama had gone viral. 6 months later, Margaret Chen sat in the sunroom of Riverside Gardens, a senior living community where she'd found the perfect balance between independence and security. Her hip had healed well, and while she still used a walker for longer distances, she could move freely around her small apartment and the community's beautiful grounds. The morning light streamed through the windows as she prepared for her weekly video call with the Portland Elder Abuse Prevention Network. What had started as her own fight for justice had evolved into advocacy work that gave her experience meaning beyond personal vindication. "Margaret, you're on mute," came a familiar voice from her laptop screen. She smiled and unmuted herself, looking at the faces of social workers, attorneys, and fellow survivors who had become her community of purpose. "Thank you all for gathering today," Margaret began. "I wanted to share an update from the Legislative Committee. The Margaret Chen Protection Act." She still felt strange hearing her name attached to legislation. "Passed the state Senate yesterday. Starting next year, Oregon will require mandatory training for healthcare providers to recognize signs of elder manipulation and medical abuse." The faces on screen showed genuine celebration. Margaret's case had become a catalyst for systemic change, forcing institutions to acknowledge how sophisticated psychological abuse could be hidden behind loving facades. After the call ended, Margaret heard a familiar voice in the hallway. "Grandma Maggie!" Tommy bounded into the sunroom, followed by David carrying a bag of groceries and flowers from their garden. Their weekly visits had become the highlight of Margaret's week, not just for the company, but for the evidence they provided that their family bonds had not just survived Jessica's assault, they had grown stronger. "Dad helped me make you something," Tommy announced, pulling a carefully wrapped package from his backpack. Margaret opened it to find a photo album titled "Our Real Family" in Tommy's careful 8-year-old handwriting. The pages were filled with pictures from their visits, Margaret teaching Tommy to play chess, David grilling burgers on the community patio, the three of them feeding ducks at the nearby pond. Jessica took down all the pictures of us, Tommy explained matter-of-factly. So we made new ones. David's eyes met Margaret's over his son's head. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, with Jessica disappearing as completely from their lives as she had from her previous relationships. The house felt peaceful now, David had told her, though it had taken months for Tommy to stop, looking over his shoulder, expecting Jessica to reappear. "How's school going, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, settling into her favorite chair with Tommy curled beside her. "Good. I had to write about someone brave for my hero report, and I wrote about you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "About me?" "Yeah. Ms. Rodriguez said real heroes are people who tell the truth even when it's scary, and even when other people don't believe them. That's exactly what you did." From the mouth of babes, Margaret thought, remembering how this same child's simple honesty had cut through Jessica's complex web of lies. David handed her the weekly letter from Marcus Rivera, whose follow-up reporting on elder abuse had won a Pulitzer nomination. "Marcus says the documentary about your case premieres next month. Are you ready for that?" Margaret nodded. The documentary crew had been respectful, focusing on the systemic issues rather than sensationalizing the personal drama. If it helps one family recognize the signs of manipulation before someone gets hurt, it's worth any discomfort. As afternoon turned to evening and David and Tommy prepared to leave, Margaret walked them to the parking lot, her steps steady and sure. She hugged her grandson tightly, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and playground dust. "I love you, Grandma Maggie," Tommy whispered. "I love you too, sweetheart, more than all the stars in the sky." David embraced her last, and she could feel the weight he still carried, guilt over not seeing Jessica's true nature sooner, shame at how close he'd come to losing both his mother and son to a manipulator's schemes. "David," she said softly, "you saved us all by finally choosing to see the truth. That took tremendous courage." "I almost chose her over you," he whispered. "But you didn't. When it mattered most, you chose truth over comfort, justice over peace. That's what real love does." After they drove away, Margaret stood in the garden, watching the sunset paint the Portland skyline in shades of gold and rose. The city looked peaceful from her perspective, but she knew that somewhere out there, other families were struggling with their own versions of Jessica. Skilled manipulators who used love as a weapon and trust as a vulnerability. Her phone buzzed, with a text from Elena Vasquez, who had become an unlikely friend through their shared experience. "Saw the news about the legislation passing. You did it, Margaret. You turned your trauma into protection for others." Margaret smiled, typing back, "We did it. All of us who refused to stay silent." As she made her way back to her apartment, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she had been a victim, isolated, gaslit, physically assaulted by someone her family trusted. Tonight, she was a survivor, who had transformed her pain into purpose, her truth into legislation, her trauma into healing for others. The security footage that had gone viral had shown an elderly woman being pushed downstairs by her daughter-in-law. But the real story, the one that mattered, was about the power of truth to survive even the most sophisticated attempts to bury it. It was about the courage of an 8-year-old boy who refused to doubt what he had seen. It was about the love between a mother and son that proved stronger than manipulation and fear. Most importantly, it was about the recognition that families could survive terrible betrayals and emerge not just intact, but stronger than before. As Margaret settled into her evening routine, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. The truth had set them all free, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help others find their own path to that same freedom. Outside her window, Portland sparkled in the darkness, full of stories yet to be told, and truths yet to be discovered. And Margaret Chen, survivor and advocate, was ready to help tell them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.